In the 1970s, the city of Boston was divided into several neighborhoods, most of which represented a certain ethnic or racial group. These neighborhoods included Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, the North End, and South Boston. Within these communities, there were different housing projects that typically contained only one group of people, united by a common ethnic or social class. These projects were in terrible condition. For example, there were cockroaches crawling out of the drains in the showers. Despite the conditions, kids from the projects in South Boston were proud of where they lived, and gave each other small dots of green ink as tattoos on their wrists, and sang songs such as the Ballad of James Connolly to show their Irish and South Boston pride. South Boston itself was divided by class. Residents living near Castle Island on the water tended to be wealthier and white, while people who lived closer to Roxbury in the housing projects, such as Old Colony, tended to be poorer, but still white. South Boston had a much larger white population and had very few black people. Even though people in the projects such as Old Colony were poor, South Boston was considered to be their paradise because everyone in the neighborhoods was very close. Despite the poverty, residents loved the close-knit nature of their community and would not want it any other way. In South Boston, while race seemed to be the main point of conflict, economic class was also a key point of tension. Although black people were always considered to be of lesser status than whites, there was still a hierarchy within the white community. People would call everyone in a class lower than their own a nigger in order to maintain these socio-economic distinctions. Along with class distinctions, within South Boston, there were racial divides across neighborhoods. There were unwritten rules, such as to never cross the line into the Columbia Point housing project, which was home to the blacks. These rules were based on the rigid societal divides that permeated South Boston, and even went as far as to prohibit the mixing of races within neighborhoods. Because of this, the residents of South Boston quote-unquote learned racism simply from the social and economic conditions within their own neighborhoods. Racial inequality was a primary point of conflict in South Boston. For example, during the busing crisis, white kids refused to go to school and instead made signs that insulted the black children. Policemen lined the streets with riot gear and tried to prevent people from interfering with the buses. White children even threw rocks at the buses. The rocks weren't just pebbles, they were actual stones meant to physically harm the black students, and at one point even the adults threw bricks. People rioted in the streets and tipped over police cars because the policemen were helping to desegregate the schools. In other words, the busing crisis caused fervent anarchy on the streets of Boston. These riots were primarily a product of the racial identities of South Boston. Thus, the forced busing of black school children appears to them as a blatant violation of their cherished domain. In this way, the riots were large, physical demonstrations of these people's conviction to their social status and their neighborhoods in general. The riots were mainly about race, but some of the hatred also came from the deeply rooted anger at people from outside communities trying to change their paradise. People including Judge Arthur Garrity, who issued the initial court order for Boston schools to desegregate and who was from Wellesley, a wealthy Boston suburb. All this hatred and inequality seems like it would be over, but it is still subtly going on. In South Boston in the 1970s, the population was almost all white people, and if you look at the 2000 census, not much has changed. Between 2000 and 2010, the population of whites in South Boston fell from 83% to 80%, while the black population grew from 5% to 8%. This equates to a 48% increase for the black population. We've come a long way from the terrible way black people were treated during the busing crisis, but we've still not achieved total equality.